everyone, and welcome to this episode of Chatting with the Lightkeeper. I'm Edward, otherwise known, I guess, here by the persona of the Lightkeeper. Anyway, this is my wonderful little podcast about the DS lifestyle. And for those of you who perhaps haven't been listening long, or maybe this is even your first episode, or you haven't caught the one where I talk about my bit of nerdiness, I am a history nerd, and believe it or not, being a history nerd, and in fact, that was my major in college and graduated with a degree in history, or as one of the examples today will kind of brings me back to a history professor that I had that referred to history as her story because it's not just his story, but it's also her story. So, what is on my mind today is my love of history, and yet I had never really looked into the history of the lifestyle. Sure, I looked back and knew about the leather scene and how that impacted where we are today, but I didn't look really beyond that or where did leather grow out of? How did it happen? So I've kind of been bumbling around and doing a little bit of research. Obviously, not something that you could roll down to your local public library and ask the librarian to help you with. Maybe I guess you could if you're in a large city, or maybe you know the librarian and the librarian's kinky too. But here in my conservative area, it was not something that I was going to recommend for myself. So, anyways, I turned to the wonderful resource that is the internet and have been digging away on this for a little while. And so today, let's hop in our TARDIS or maybe your DeLorean or a time machine, whatever works for you. And let's go back in time. So, the first thing that surprised me about all of this is I kind of had the assumption that DS grew out of probably nothing before 1800, and well, I was wrong. And before we get into that, I do need to kind of preface all of this by saying I looked at history as how it kind of came to be in the United States, where I live. Um, and so obviously, other parts of the world are going to have different stories. But where we end up is kind of where we are today, at least pretty much across the board, but it's kind of specific how it grew in the United States. So, if you're listening in the UK or Australia, it's probably going to be a little bit of a different history. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of clarify that so you understand the perspective of where this is coming from. So, as I started my research, I was surprised to find that you can find references to things that we would now consider BDSM, going back as far as ancient Mesopotamia. If you're unsure of where Mesopotamia is, think of modern Iraq, kind of between the Tigris and Euphrates River, was this wonderful society in ancient times called Mesopotamia. And I guess that would be around, you know, 30, 31. I don't know, 3100 BC, long before the birth of the baby Jesus. So it's long time ago, and there back then the stories and little pieces parts that exist of things kind of lifestyle related typically involve gods and goddesses. One of the more famous ones and is going to be called Ishtar, and she was the goddess of passion and fertility. Um, and I kind of immediately found it funny, not funny, haha, but interesting, funny, that passion was a part of the description of what the goddess was, goddess of. And the, I guess you could say, teachings um, revolve around two main reasons for sex. Um, of course, I'm sure everybody out there knows that sex equals kids, and the more kids you have, especially back then, that means the more powerful your society and your nation could be. So obviously, procreation was a big part of, you know, Ishtar's job as a goddess to make sure that the good citizens were out procreating. But also, surprisingly, pleasure. That's right. Sex is pleasurable, and we as humans should enjoy it. Even our goddess wants us to enjoy sex. So it was kind of surprising and shocking, but yes, sex even then was seen as a means to have pleasure and enjoy pleasure. Going along with this, Ishtar would enjoy whipping her worshippers and get them sexually aroused by being whipped. So yeah, very, very BDSM-y, get out the whip and start flogging away and get everybody riled up, hot and bothered and ready for some passionate sex. Another wonderful little tidbit is she worshipped her vagina. And so in a way, a very, I guess you could say, feminist goddess. And she also liked it, as legend has it, when men would wear women's clothing for either pleasure, her pleasure, their pleasure, or sometimes for as a means to punish, humiliate men. So, I mean, even things that are seen as something like that has been around since, basically history started trying to be recorded. And it is also said that obviously, if she is the goddess of, you know, sex and pleasure, that stands to reason that she would love sex, and it was not seen kind of as a taboo or naughty thing, and it was something to be loved and enjoyed. So, I guess we can go back to ancient times and look at something, and in the modern world, there is the bad saying that says, you know, what is a nymphomaniac? Well, a nymphomaniac is simply a woman who loves sex as much as the average man, which is, a crapola saying, but it is what it is. Or in DS, somebody who loves sex could be considered a slut, and I don't mean that in the negative connotation that sometimes vanillas apply to it, but in DS, slut is something that is kind of taken oftentimes as a compliment. So perhaps in the lifestyle, we could drop using that word and just, if you're somebody who loves sex or your partner loves sex or you love sex together, you could be gods and goddesses because, going back to ancient Mesopotamia, sex was something to be enjoyed and to be loved and also, break out the whip and get things hot and bothered and get it rolling. But yeah, so we could, if you love sex, you're a god or goddess. Be an interesting way to frame it. So, anyway, at this point, before we kind of move on from ancient Mesopotamia, boy, it's a tough word to say, um, and get into our friends, the Greeks and Romans, um, let's take a short break, do the little sponsorship bit, and we'll be right back after this. All right, welcome back, and thank you for listening there. So we've gone from the really ancient times of Mesopotamia. Now we made it to the Greeks and Romans, and part of Greek and Roman mythology or religion is something called flagellation. And no, that doesn't mean that you're kind of gassy, but it is using a flogger or a whip. And they did it for two reasons, um, for religious discipline and for pleasure. Uh, if you're kind of curious what the religious discipline side looks like, it's kind of freaky. But if you've ever seen the movie The Da Vinci Code with Tom Hanks, I know it's a bit older now, but that does show flagellation being used for religious discipline rather than pleasure. And like I said, at least in the movie, it's very freaky, and the concept still is very freaky to me. But In Greece, they actually had the tomb of whipping, and in Rome, it was the tomb of flogging, or maybe tomb temple. Sometimes, let's just say my Roman and Greek language skills are not the best, so did rely a little bit on the internet. So maybe we're temple rather than tomb. But in both of these places, people would go to be flogged either for punishment or pleasure. Gee, boy, that kind of sounds a little bit like DS, doesn't it? Using pain for pleasure or for punishment? Yeah, kind of does. So also back then, they did this not only for pleasure in place of coitus, um, or sex, or whatever you want to call it, but it was also done as foreplay. So you could, get yourself whipped up into a frenzy and then, bow chicka wow wow with your partner. So very much like some of BDSM is today. So we move on from the Greeks and Romans and we head on over to India. And I'm sure a few of you are guessing where this is going. We're going to talk a little bit about the Karma Sutra. And the Karma Sutra dates from about 200 in the Common Era. And what's interesting is the Karma Sutra does mention things that, are now part of, BDSM play. It talks about spanking, biting, playful grabs, pinching, all of those great things as ways to enhance sexual pleasure. But it also does two things which I think are fantastic. And this is, you know, very, very ancient. It talks about having to have the consent of the woman to do this too. Um, because not all women, it admits, not all women enjoy these things. So you need to make sure that they are consenting. Um, and the other thing is, it also talks about where to and where not to strike, bite, grab, etc. So you actually have consent in doing activities safely involved in this ancient text, which is absolutely fantastic and amazing to see that consent and safety were something that the ancients, they talked about and took seriously. So it's just that was really kind of cool to me. So after the Karma Sutra, unfortunately, we're kind of going to go into the Dark Ages, which, well, they're dark. There's really not a big historical record there. And then we kind of get into the Enlightenment, where we start to have some more historical documents and things being created in Europe. And once again, remember this is coming from an American, so yes, the history is going to be predominantly flow through Europe to America, even though there are other means and there are some records of indigenous people um, practicing things BSDS related. Unfortunately, it's something that I didn't find a whole lot of good information about, so I'm trying to stick to things that I know to be hopefully truthful. That far back, we don't know for sure. It's kind of making best assumptions, and we all know assumptions can bite our butts. So, anyways, now that that little, I guess, mini disclaimer is over, um, there, starts to be more, some of the things that are now being written again and preserved. They didn't just get written and disappear, but you're finding where whipping is getting mentioned here and there for both pleasure and also rituals, often tied to religion and the church. Um, so you're starting to see it appear here and there again. And then about 1300 in the Common Era, um, our good friend Jesus gets involved in all of this. But pretty amazing. He's been dead for 1300 years, but it's time for him to get involved. But not the way you think. Um, And so this is about the time when the church starts to put more rules and regulation, if you will, on sex. But this is the surprise. It I guess if Devo existed, or maybe Devo is a reincarnation of a, I don't know, a band that played some, I don't know, what would you call a pub back then? Tavern, maybe? I don't know. But if, they played back then, they probably could have a version of Whip It that would be, church approved, because some whipping was seen as a replacement for sex, especially, kind of little assumption here, but let's say you're a young man and you are hot and heavy with a young lady, or whatever, however your partnership and desires work. But back then, it would have to be man and woman. Jesus is still pretty uptight about that if it's not man and woman. But anywho, sorry, I had to get that out. Anyway, so whipping could be in place of coitus. You could choose to get your get your yayas out with a whip, rather than actually being extremely naughty and engaging in sex before marriage. I've always wondered this, speaking of that. If you don't have any intention of marrying the person, is it really premarital sex? Okay. Anyway, bump bump, bad joke. But you also start to see DS rituals kind of in the courtship and love things going on with some of the kings and queens in their courts. Oftentimes there would be, you'd have to show dedication or leadership or submitting to leadership in these romances that are happening in the courts of the enlightened kings and queens, and definitely queens, because you don't need to look, any farther than, say, Catherine the Great for somebody who, well, I think Catherine would definitely have been a very dominant female, and definitely definitely didn't play by the rules of the day, shall we say. But so you had some DS themes, going through the royal houses of Europe. And so we'll take those themes and we will once again hop in our time machine and fast forward to 1748, maybe 1749. It's little fuzzy and there are differing opinions. So we'll say one of those 2 years. And for you Americans listening, to put this in context, the United States was not a country. We were still these colonies attached to this place called England. George Washington would be a precocious 16-year-old, probably with like most 16-year-old men, or 16-year-old boys, little sex on the brain. But anyway, so there's this guy in a debtor's prison in England, which I'm not sure that they had a lot of time on their hands. But anyways, this guy, John Cleveland, found the time to write a novel. And what he writes is called Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. Some of you may know it better by its kind of, I guess, pseudo title called Fanny Hill. Um, as you might imagine, it is told from the vantage point or the view. It's told like by Fanny, um, except Fanny is actually a guy who's writing it, but it's Fanny who's telling the story. And during Fanny Hill, we get stories of whippings, and not just for punishment, but for pleasure and sadomasochism. Um, and in a way, it's considered, and it's debatable. Once again, we're in that it's history, it's back, so it's debatable. But really, it's the first erotic novel, because it's truly just about sex. If you can imagine that, when George Washington was not lying about chopping down his neighbor's cherry tree. So we go from that, and in the early 1800s, here in the United States, we were in the middle of this wonderful religious revival. Somehow, many Americans felt that we had gotten away from Christianity, and it was big revival of Christianity and really uptightness spreading across the country, even though, half the country lived south of the Mason-Dixon line and believed that they could own people and be good Christians while owning other humans. Yeah. So, anyways, that's a little screwed up. But so while America's going through this religious revival, things are a little randy over in Europe. And they're starting to get some S&M fiction going on being written, and it's, getting a small cult following all around Europe. And then in 1872, another English gent named John Camden, he writes this little book, and it's called Fashionable Lectures Delivered with Birch Discipline. Um, and what it's about is, about women who spank men. And the birch part comes from a tool for spanking called a switch. It's not a roll here, it's a tool. It's a whippy stick. Um, and birch trees make great whippy sticks for swatting behinds. And in fact, sometimes you can even kind of tie bundles of birch sticks together and make a bigger, more powerful switch. Anyway, so they can be fun to play with. I've been known to enjoy using them, but when they talk about rods in the book, um, they're talking about these birch switches, the whippy sticks. So when you see rod in this context, it's a whippy stick that is getting applied to somebody's bottom. And so this is over 150 years, 151, maybe, if my rudimentary math skills are good. I do call math mental abuse to humans, so I could be off there because I did it in my head. So I apologize if I am wrong. But so over 150 years ago, um, there's written record of professional dominatrix. It's pay to play, BDSM fun. And he actually, in this book, included the information for contacts to, ways for men to contact these professional dominatrixes in the London area. So it's kind of fascinating to think that, you know, that's been around for that long. So now it's time to kind of hop in our time machines one more time because not a whole lot changes. I mean, Europe is still much more progressive and sexually open than over here in the repressed America. The next big earth shattering events to happen are the First and Second World Wars. During that period of time, you have roughly, and this is a more of an estimate, not actual digging into numbers, but roughly 5 million young American men go to Europe during the First and Second War. And, as we know, Europe is much more sexually open. I mean, I can still remember um, being an 18-year-old studying abroad, and my TV guide in Germany had a topless woman on it. Woohoo! I mean, I'm 18 and there's boobies, and it's my TV guide, and it's put here by the hotel. I mean, fabulous. It doesn't get much better than that. So, anyway, so you have these 5 million American young men that go to Europe, experience a much more sexually open culture and places. And of course, they're young men, so they are very they're separated from home. So things that didn't fly at home are now suddenly in demand, like um, the use of profanity. The American soldier, very profane. And part of that comes out of, okay, mom and dad won't let me say this, but now I'm around other young men who will accept me saying it, and it makes me seem tougher. So, F bombs are being dropped everywhere. And not to mention that, you have all these young men that are filled with sexual energy. That's what young people have, sexual energy. And now you have this sexual energy and all of this in a much more sexually open society. So eyes are being opened, minds are being exposed to new things. Some of those stories about flogging and rudimentary, I guess you could say, DS and experiences that soldiers may have had, um, all kind of open their minds to, well, there's more than just getting married and having sex for procreation. Hmm. interesting stuff. So in a way, it's mind blowing, mind opening, and so then they've had these experiences. The wars are over. They come back home, and once they get home, they obviously have had experiences that are going to be changing. So we'll kind of come back to what happens when they get back to the States. But the next big thing on the world stage of BDSM to happen came in 1954, and this is a novel that I think some of you listening have read. It's called The Story of O. It's something that I read very early in my journey, and it's something I can still remember reading and keeping hidden in my backpack in college because I didn't want it to fall out in front of my friends and have to explain it. Parts of it were very erotic to me, very, very, wow, this is like a huge turn on. God, why is this turning me on? It shouldn't be a turn on. Well, that's repulsive. It was a mixed bag. It was all over the place. But it was for me a very impactful book to read, which I did read more than once because I had to figure it out or try to figure it out and try to figure out what the effect it was having on me. Um, so this comes out, and more people are reading, and more people are kind of had their minds open. And in the United States, they've had their minds open because they've seen things that have opened their mind. In the story of also creates more people writing BDSM fiction. And maybe by today's standards, some of it might seem light or tame, but there's more and more of this fictional work that incorporates the lifestyle. So more and more people are reading, seeing, and experiencing through the printed page DS. So now I get to use my favorite corporate conference call saying, circle back. All right, let's circle back to all those soldiers coming home from Europe after the wars, especially World War II. Many of them found that they enjoyed the hierarchy and the camaraderie of the military. It was something that they found enjoyable. The other thing that happened to some of the veterans is when they came home, they didn't fit. Their experiences they didn't fit with where they used to be in life. They didn't come home and just pick up the job they had before they left. They found that, they just didn't fit in with the world. And this is especially true of gay men who served during World War II. Um, it's kind of interesting. The only real like there was never a question that was asked of anybody who enlisted or was drafted, are you gay? Because obviously that would preclude, you wouldn't be able to serve if you were openly gay. There was one question that everyone was asked. Every man was asked when they joined the military or were drafted, and it was simple. Do you like girls? That's exactly the question. As long as you said yes, you were in. So if you were gay and liked girls as friends, and you said, "Yeah, hey, I like girls. They're great friends." Bam. Yeah, I like girls. Congratulations, you're in. And then if you said no, then you were out. It didn't matter if, say you were a 25-year-old who is going to join the military and says, "No, I don't like girls because I'm a man and I like women." So I say no. Well, boom, he's out because he might be gay because he just said he didn't like girls. So, anyways, that was the whole don't ask, don't tell criteria for the American soldier in World War II. Obviously, if you got caught, I guess we'll say fraternizing with another man, then um, you would be out of the Army or Navy or Marines or Coast Guard, or Merchant Marine, whatever in whatever capacity you were serving, you would be out. But those were the only two things that were there about sexuality, and so you had obviously gay men serving, and they found in the army a lot of times that they found friends, camaraderie, and were accepted, um, surprisingly enough, by many of their peers. And so when they came home from their service, obviously you have some who men who are just not fitting in. They might be straight, they might be gay, they just don't fit with the post-war society and what it says that you should be doing. You should get married, have kids, buy a house, perhaps go to school, go to trades, whatever it is. They're not fitting in. And so in the 1950s in America, where did people who didn't fit in with what society says you should be, where could you go to find acceptance? Especially if you were gay, where would you go to find that? And the answer is, might surprise you, but motorcycle clubs. Motorcycle clubs were where people who, sort of didn't fit in everywhere else, a lot of people found their homes, a lot of men found their homes in motorcycle clubs, because they were kind of outlaws, I guess you could say. And if you were a gay man, I mean, when was the last time you were driving down the highway and you passed or were passed by a group of, leather wearing motorcycle riding men, and they all went past you and you thought, oh, there's a group of gay guys? It's probably never happened to you or never occurred to you. And so in the time period where you had to be closeted and be gay, a motorcycle club was an excellent place because motorcyclists were thought as very masculine. These clubs often were found, the men were manly men who just happened to be also gay. And of course, they wore leather because they rode motorcycles. And the club allowed them to be a safe place for them to be gay men and be surrounded by other gay men. And since the clubs were closed to the outside world, you could be a gay man and be involved and basically have it be a very closeted thing. And out of this, of course, now it's more of the leather scene or leather, because obviously these men were motorcycle riders and they wore leather. So the leather is sort of the how it's talked about nowadays, like, oh, the leather scene. But it's out of this and that military background that if you hear somebody say they're old guard in the lifestyle, this is where they're referring back to, because there was structure, that military experience that these people went through and they liked carried over into the structure of really of DS. And it very now would be considered very high protocol. And you had things like if you were a submissive man and you were talking, but a dominant male interjected, you were expected to be quiet until the dominant gave you permission to speak. Not whether it's your dominant, but just very hierarchical. If the group of dominants were speaking and the most experienced dominant started to speak, the other dominant men were expected to be quiet and allow the veteran or the most experienced member of the club, in that clique that's talking, to have the floor. And then when he relinquished it, then the lesser experienced could then join the conversation. But it's very protocolish, very much almost military discipline style that came with these clubs. And so the modern BDSM experience where we see some of the old guard things kind of comes out of these bike clubs, these leather groups, and they still exist today. In fact, in my local community, there is still a very strong leather presence. Um, yes, that's still men and women who love to wear leather. The motorcycle riding isn't as important, but many still do ride. Um, it is still very high percentage of gay men who are involved in the leather scene. However, it is not just gay men anymore. The leather community has opened up, and it is very much more open. Although, if you're a straight male and you're going to go to one of these events, understand that there will be a high percentage of gay men around you. And if that bothers you, a leather event is not the place to go. I'm just saying that just so you can be aware. Also, if you're a straight man, something to keep in mind. I love my Detroit. Well, hey, there you go. You know where my local scene is. I love the leather community because when they do have um, like educational, like they actually have educational um, meetings, munches, um, or even some of their play parties are geared where things are very educational. But as a straight man, or if you were a woman, there doesn't matter whether what your how you identify as a woman. There, like in my community, there are certain sections of there where they meet that are off limits to you because that it's just separate for gay men. So you have to understand that it's still a predominantly gay thing, but it's really kind of and gay thing isn't the right words. It's a very bad, poor choice of words on my part. It's still predominantly led by gay men. Maybe that's better wording. But for example, every year there's a Mr. Leather competition that happens at local communities all around the country, and then the local Mr. Leathers gather nationally where they crown a national Mr. Leather. And in my community, the regional Mr. Leather is actually a woman this year. So it's kind of interesting to see somebody. This is our community's Mr. Leather, and here's a woman representing the leather community. So it really has evolved from from where it was. So the next big revolution that happens in the lifestyle, maybe you can guess, but it's the internet. The internet brings all things great to everyone, right? And in fact, this is where many people think that the lifestyle came from, is people in chat rooms talking, sharing fantasies, and out of that grew the lifestyle. Nope, as you can see, the lifestyle's been around for forever and ever. So the internet comes. Let me just share with you a little bit of my experience involved in the lifestyle before the internet, which means, yes, that means I'm old. God, it sounds horrible to say, but yeah, I'm old. I'm old enough to be pre-internet old. Um, Before the internet, if you were looking for information on DS, you had to find it in wonderful locations like adult bookstores, which I remember the first one I went into, I thought adult bookstore meant that there was no children's section. And yeah, there'd probably be a higher percentage of nudie magazines, but it would be books as well. And in a way, there were books, like you could find the story of O there. You could find like local periodicals, like local magazines. And I use that term loosely because the one that kind of chronicled or talked about things going on in the local BDSM community that I was a part of when I first started was something that was obviously photocopied and then stapled together and came out quarterly. And they talked about events that happened. Obviously, no real names were used, and there were mentions of group names. And before I even knew what these groups were, but it was fascinating because there was no way to say contact the group that they were talking about, so you didn't know whether it was real or fiction. But it was fascinating that somebody was going out and putting out basically a part educational periodical about what's going on in the local community, with a Xerox machine and a stapler. But that was what it was. And yes, you had your dirty magazines and your porn, but that was how you connected with people, pre-internet. In fact, to attend a munch, and once again, this is community specific. This is my experience. To attend a munch, you had to meet with um, either one or multiple of the munch's leaders. And remember, a munch is just an informal gathering of people in the lifestyle. It's no, assless chaps and I love BDSM T-shirt. It's just come as you are. Let's meet at a restaurant, have dinner, and socialize amongst other kinksters. So to attend one of those, you had to meet with either the leader or one of their chosen like vetters before you would be invited to the munch because you didn't know when or where the munch was. There was no internet for you to look it up, so you had to be invited, at a certain date and certain time and, a certain restaurant. And so if you didn't have that information, you obviously couldn't go. In a way, it was good because it weeded out some of the my favorite word here, twat waffles. It weeded out some of the twat waffles from joining the community. Something that, looking back, and I don't know for sure if this is true or not, but it seems logical. I wish I could do a good Mr. Spock impression, um, but I can't, so I won't. But it seems logical that it also would stifle alternative views. People like to be surrounded by like minds. They like to, sing to their choir. So you may have had people who had differing approaches to the lifestyle be shut out of certain groups because their views or their approaches were different. Another thing about the Munches that because they were so that there was vetting and they were secretive, really, is people would not be allowed back. Like if you acted like an idiot, you would not be invited to the next munch. And since if you weren't invited, you didn't know when and where it was going to be, so you just couldn't, look and see. Oh, here over on FetLife, it lists the munch is going to be Tuesday night at. I'll be there. You weren't invited, so you didn't know, and you were kind of kicked to the curb. Um, the other thing too is the lifestyle was not a sex positive place. And by that I mean, yes, you knew that people had sex. You knew that they had kinky sex. But at events, even if it was an educational munch where they or an educational event where they did demonstrations and we'll go back to the old standby use of spanking. Um, Spanking can be great foreplay, but it was never presented as foreplay. It was like you spanked your partner and then, hey, what you do on that after that is up to you and we're not going to talk about it. So it was very much like there was BDSM and there was sex, and they were two parallel lines that didn't intersect. So if you had a play party where people gathered to indulge in BDSM play, nowadays, the great majority of these gatherings are sex positive, meaning not only can you engage in the BDSM play, but if that crosses over into sex and within the rules of that event, then so be it. But back then, there was no sex. You did not They were very separate worlds. Even now, we are starting to see with a lifestyle, that convergence of sex and the lifestyle, which is fantastic. And you're seeing things like swingers groups becoming more interested, even if it's just the kinky sex side of DS. But you're seeing a more convergence and a crossover. Back then, people who were swingers and people who were involved in BDSM or DS, there was almost like, I don't know, like like there was some sort of rivalry where if you were into one, you couldn't be into the other, and they looked down their noses at each other. It was really weird, but there was no crossover. So the internet has really opened up the lifestyle. It's no longer a secret society where you have to go through a vetting process just to have dinner with other open-minded, kinky people. It's also provided an anonymity, which is fantastic, which makes it easier for somebody to explore the lifestyle without fear of being outed. Because it is a fear, especially if you're new. What if I start looking into this and discover my neighbor or my boss or one of my in-laws or my cousin? All these things, but it gives you the anonymity um, to um, to go out and explore and to learn about it without having to reveal who you are. Um, and why, those of us involved in the DS lifestyle, I don't think we'll ever be like the cool kids. at the cool kids lunch table, if thinking back to those days. But another thing that happened to the lifestyle, and I think it's a good thing, and I know there are going to people that are going to hear some words I'm going to say and be like, "Oh my God, no, no, you can't put that together." But when the whole 50 Shades movies made their mark on the lifestyle, I think it was a fantastic thing. Um, yes, they're fiction. Yes, they're unrealistic. Yes, they portray some unsafe practices, unsafe beliefs. Absolutely. The important thing to remember is they're works of fiction. They're not supposed to be true. There's the joke if 50 Shades happened in a trailer park, it would be an episode of Criminal Minds versus an erotic thriller on the big screen. And if you don't know Criminal Minds, it's TV show where these law enforcement people investigate sex crimes or kidnappings or heinous crimes of, normally always involving a kidnapping or a missing person or serial killer type thing. So, anyway, that's Criminal Minds. But 50 Shades, yes, the premise and it's all fiction. But what it did was it brought DS and BDSM to a wider audience. It made it less taboo for you to share with somebody that this was something that was of interest to you. It made it okay for a couple to go see 50 Shades and be like, I've always had fantasies that way. Oh, me too. And so it opened up the discussion. Plus, it has also opened up more and more erotic fiction writers. I'm sorry, I'm not a big movie buff on the latest and greatest things coming down the movie pike, um, but I think it's going to allow for more people to get interested and to be accepted in their own mind to come look at what DS is all about. So I think 50 Shades was another important step in the history of the lifestyle and in a positive sense. So yeah, I'm weird like that, but that's what I think. So that's sort of from then, from all the way back in ancient times between the Tigris and Euphrates River and over in Iraq to where we are now with going to the theater to see 50 Shades, hopping online to check our kinky blogs, our kinky Instagrams, and kinky Facebooks, and connecting with other kinky people anonymously. Um, I hope you've kind of enjoyed this little trip. If you are curious about really going in depth and digging really into all sorts of things that have happened and have been discovered with kinky history, well, hop on over to wherever you get your podcast and type that in, Kinky History. There's a great podcast out there called Kinky History, which I've only listened to snippets because it came to mind when I was chatting with a friend about this. They're like, "Oh, have you listened to this podcast?" I'm like, "No," and I'll catch a few snippets, but I didn't want to really give it a listen. The parts I heard were fantastic. That's why I'm recommending it. But I didn't want to really give it a listen until after I got my own history nerd version of history out there, in which I've done. So, but if this fascinates you, you know, just go over to wherever you get your podcast and type in kinky history and give her a listen. She's amazing. She's funny. I believe she's Australian or New Zealander, a New Australian or New Zealander. So if accents are your thing, you get the sexy accent. Or if you're listening from you know, down under. I guess it's not really a sexy accent, it's just how everybody sounds. So, anyway, um, there's that. So, I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed today's podcast. I hope I didn't put anybody to sleep like a history professor might in a classroom. That wasn't my intent. So, hey, if you were asleep, wake up, wake up. History class is over. Um, now that you're awake, don't forget to click the follow button so you never miss an episode of Chatting with the Lightkeeper. And let's make this week amazing. And I look forward to chatting with you again next week.